This is Professor Wham. Now, after I finished with the first two installments of ICE, I told a couple friends about it, and they listened to it. And they asked me to include the information that I'm going to be talking about in this third section, this third installment, which hopefully will not be nearly as long as the first two because it's fairly specific. And as I prepared the information for this, I realized that it was a good idea because I could link it back to at least one of the runes that I mentioned in one of the previous videos, but did not actually talk about very much. So it'll give me a chance to sort of round that out. So they wanted me to talk specifically about the reality, or I guess you would say the idea of the Wendigo. The Wendigo is this is a word from the Cree, which are an Algonquin people who now principally live in Canada. And this is their word for a being that haunts the winter landscape, principally the winter landscape. Although its spirit can haunt a place all year round, most of the stories about it come from the winter months. And its name, it's difficult to translate, but it refers to the experience of kind of an infinite starvation, kind of a spirit of infinite starvation. And it is often portrayed as having an icy heart. Now, I will be giving some stories, brief stories about the Wendigo, and they come from a book that it might be possible for you to get. I had some difficulty getting it when I got it. It's called Where the Chill Came From, Cree Wendigo Tales and Journeys, that were gathered and translated by a man named Howard Norman. And he was an individual who actually took the time to learn Cree, especially Swampy Cree, which is one of the dialects of Cree. I think there are 4 or 5 principal dialects. And he actually collected these stories directly from oral speakers, people who either knew of the principles that were being talked about in the stories, had experienced this themselves, or had these stories passed down to them. So the stories are, right from, primary sources. But a little bit about the idea of the Wendigo first. The idea of the Wendigo, or the Wendigo, is kind of a bad spirit, or I don't know what to call it, a meme. That's sort of what it's become, especially in video games and in some short horror fiction. But the common idea of the Wendigo actually can be traced back to this particular story by Algernon Blackwood, which was first published, let's see if I can find it here. It was first published in 1910. And it is supposed to be based on actual folklore. Algernon, I believe, was a Canadian horror fiction writer, or short story writer, and you can find his version of it online. It's public domain, so it's not difficult to find. But he portrayed it as a kind of monster that made humans go crazy, kind of obsessed, and then would carry them away and consume them. And this is actually pretty much what the tradition about the Wendigo does say about the Wendigo. There is in this particular story, the story that he tells, you have white folks who are going up into the wilderness, and they're going to hunt and do kind of manly things, and there's an indigenous person with him who's described as kind of a dirty little Indian. That's kind of the terminology that's used to describe the person. I can't even remember what the guy's name is, the indigenous guy. And these signs start appearing in the camp, and the indigenous guy knows what is going on, but of course the white guys don't know. And one white guy decides he's going to go out and confront it, and of course, in vain, he gets taken away. But the description of the Wendigo is what has come down to us, so that when you're looking at, when the Wendigo appears in video games or in other kinds of media like that, it's taken almost entirely from this book as sort of, or this story as sort of the beginning point. And it's terrifying enough, actually. The story is, even though it's got some racist overtones, it is pretty creepy. It's worth checking out in that regard. However, for the Cree, the Wendigo is a far more subtle kind of spirit or entity. It's not always strictly embodied in the fashion that it's talked about in this particular story by Blackwood. It's more of a spirit, and it can infect or affect a place, an experience, a region. It can even affect your mood in a certain way. In fact, in a lot of these Cree stories, people who are said to have indigo or Wendigo spirits are individuals who suddenly events, or maybe gradually events over time, what we would call sociopathic behavior. I mean, that's the title that we would give it in our culture. And sometimes it's associated with what's called snow stick sickness. That's what happens to people sometimes. We now know that there are some people who are affected by the lack of sunlight in certain parts of the world, especially up in the northern climes, and that drives some people a little nuts. And so it's often associated with that kind of moodiness. But I'll read you a few stories, or I'll tell you a couple stories, and you can kind of get a sense of the vibe that's being talked about here. What's different, though, the way the Wendigo is often portrayed in some of the more sort of fantastic literature now, is that for the Cree, a Wendigo was always once a human being. They all started out as human beings, and in this sense, they are very different from, say, a frost giant in the Norse tradition, or a Stalu in the Sami tradition, or even a Bigfoot. Better analogies to the Wendigo would be the European vampire, and even though this is understood to be an ancient being, the kind of hunger that the Wendigo has the only analogy that I can think of for it, other than a vampire, the European vampire, is in the writings of Tolkien. There's a description of a creature called Ungoliant, who gives birth to the giant spiders. The one of which tries to kill Frodo at a certain point, and Shelob, the giant spider. But Ungoliant is described as being a creature that was ever hungry and ever thirsty. It was like her hunger was insatiable, kind of like in the Buddhist hungry ghost realms. There's a sense of of desire and hunger that simply cannot be quenched. And if you combine that in the Wendigo, if you combine that with the kind of that hunger with the kind of narcissistic coldness of someone who is psychopathic or sociopathic, because they often describe the Wendigo as having like an icy heart. It's someone who's been wounded by starvation, wounded by something like that causes that. Then you can kind of get a sense of the intensity that's being talked about here. The Cree describe the Wendigo when they describe a person going Wendigo or Wendigo wandering into a place where Wendigo is. They don't provide a visual of Wendigo. In fact, in none of these stories and where the chill came from do you see Wendigo. Wendigo never appears. In Blackwood's story, there is finally a sighting of Wendigo towards the end of the story. And that's where you get the description here of that you see here in this drawing. But the Cree don't describe Wendigo. They don't provide a visual, because from their perspective, if you were to do that, you might actually invite the creature to visit. So you don't draw it, it's like you look at it obliquely by describing its effects. So you detail the effects of its attention upon the prey of which it is focused. For example, in one story, because Wendigo can also affect not only humans, but can affect animals too. So in one story, the porcupines they discover a Wendigo, and they go and ask a weasel to help them kill it because they can't. And soon the weasel arrived, and they're asking. They point out where the Wendigo is located, because the person who's being affected by the Wendigo is kind of paralyzed and shivering. And so the weasel says you need to conjure a storm around the Wendigo in order to confuse it, in order to distract it. And so they conjure a storm, and a great storm whirled up. It was like a whirlwind. And while the Wendigo, while the Wendigo came to try to consume the human being that was being affected by the Wendigo, the weasel it was confused by the wind, and the weasel was able to slip in and slip down the Wendigo's throat and chew its icy heart and kill it. And usually when you kill a Wendigo, it sort of melts away. It just sort of dissipates. But you notice they haven't described the Wendigo. They haven't described what it looks like. And that when the Wendigo crawled out of its remains, all of the other animals had to help warm the weasel up, because he had chewed the Wendigo's heart, and so there was a danger that he would become a Wendigo himself. And so they all had to warm him up and warm him up and warm him up until he could let go. So then they took the person who had been affected by Wendigo, and they took him in and put him by the fire so that he would quit shivering, because the Wendigo had affected him. So you see here, a Wendigo is not just simply this being like, like a Bigfoot or something that comes and takes you away. It's much more than that. It's an affect and an effect. It affects your mind. It affects your ability to think. It affects your ability to remember who you are, to remember where you are, to lose track of where you are in reality. So let me give you another story here. Oftentimes, Wendigo shows up around hunters who are trying to go out into the wilderness, either by themselves or with others, to try to hunt in difficult circumstances. So there's a sense in which Wendigo sort of lies in wait for people who are hunting out of profound need because they're starving in the middle of winter. So this is the story of the memory mud Wendigo. This person's name is Kakwu, which also means porcupine. And it just starts out, he fell into a suck hole. Some other hunters arrived and pulled him out. While they were cleaning mud off their arms, one asked Kakwu, "Why did you fall in that suck hole again? It's the same one you fell in 2 days ago." Kakwu said, "I fell into it yesterday too, but I got myself out that time." Now that greatly worried the village about Kakwu. "That mud hole has your memory," an elder said. "Yes, there are places that can take your memory that way," another said. So see, the suck hole was a manifestation of the Wendigo. It had the ability to take his memory, and so that he didn't remember that he had fallen in it before. So it was that Kakwu, who usually had a good memory, fell into the suck hole 3 days in a row. There was some laughing about that, although the next day Kakwu did not go out hunting, he stayed behind. When the other hunters returned, they saw some women there cleaning mud off their arms. So basically he'd stayed behind, all the hunters had gone in, but Kakwu had disappeared again. And one hunter said, "Did Kakwu venture out again?" "No," a woman replied. "He fell into a suck hole right here in the village." So the suck hole has moved. You see, the suck hole is moving around. And then everyone saw Kakwu walk out of his matakwan, that's his dwelling. He walked straight into the suck hole. He said to it, "Old friend, I'm back." And many people hurried to keep him from leaping in. So see, he had become accustomed to being sucked into the suck hole. A Wendigo is causing this, I'm certain of it. It's trying to capture Kakwu this way, an elder said. In the morning, some things were decided. When the hunters set out, they sent Kakwu ahead. They had a plan. Right away, Kakwu found a suck hole and jumped in. This time he jumped in, you see. He didn't fall in. One elder quickly said, "Let me close my eyes." He began conjuring. The elder, while conjuring, said, "The storekeeper at the Hudson Bay Company is showing someone a sharp tool. We can use that." With this, he conjured the screwdriver there. He put the screwdriver on the end of a birch staff and then heated it up in a fire that the others had built. Then they waited, and the Wendigo arrived. And when it arrived, they stabbed its chest. They jumped out and stabbed its chest, which killed it, because it was heated, and so they could stab its icy heart. The next day out hunting, Kakwu didn't fall into mud. He remembered where not to walk. And that's the story. But there's a lot in there, as you can see. It's like a Wendigo sets a trap, and the trap sucks your memory, and you can't remember that you have fallen into the suck hole. You get to the point with your hunger that you go to the same place with your hunger over and over and over again, and you forget that you've done this thing over and over again, and then finally the Wendigo can come and get you. But then there's the whole thing about conjuring. The elders, they cause a screwdriver to actually materialize in their midst. So there's magic here. There's this incredible assumption of magic. These are really wonderful stories like that. But the important thing about the Wendigo is that it's not like, and shouldn't be likened to, frost giants or anything like that. These are human beings that somehow, for some reason, the modus operandi of their life has changed, and they've been conquered by this spirit of hunger that is so intense that it causes them to wish harm on other people, to basically cannibalize other people. Even whole villages can be affected by Wendigo. Now, how this connects to these runes, and I'm just going to talk about this briefly. The rune to your right that looks like the vertical with the uneven crosshatch across it, that is a rune that is called Naud. And this is one of the most complex runes in the rune row, and it is associated with ice in the following ways. It represents a couple of things. The first thing that it is telling this, well, three things, but it represents, one of the things it represents or is picturing is what's called the construction of a need fire. And what, in fact, the word naud means need, like the kind of need that a village would have if it was starving, if it was unable to hunt. And one of the things that at least Scandinavians would do, and Germanic and Anglo-Saxon people would do, is if in the middle of, if a great misfortune came to a village, or in the middle of the winter, if the hunting was bad, and sometimes they would do this on winter solstice night, just as a way of starting over and kind of purifying things. You basically would put out all the fires in the village, and then you would build a new fire using that bow and spindle method, where you have to work really hard and create the friction to build a new fire. And that's what this rune represents, is that bow and spindle method. And then you would create a new fire, and then the new fires throughout the village would be lit from it. It was kind of a way of starting over again. And apparently there were some indigenous peoples in the Americas who had a similar kind of ritual. I can't remember who it was exactly, but I've heard about it. But certainly Germanic peoples did this. And it was a way by which to stave off difficulty. And that difficulty could manifest in a number of ways. It could, they don't talk about the Wendigo spirit. Obviously, they don't have that terminology, but they do talk about winter sickness, so snow sickness. What happens in a village where starvation sets in, or some kind of disease sets in, or some other type of privation. So that was used as a means by which to sort of keep the icy heart, if you will, from establishing itself in a village. But this particular form was also used for cursing. There was a particular kind of cursing apparatus that was called a mouthing pole, and it was a way by which to curse not only your enemies, but the land of your enemies. And I'm not going to go very much into it because it is a very black magic. And I actually do know the details of how it is done. I've never done it, but my understanding is that it was something that was periodically done up until very recently in the 20th century against rivals, political rivals or personal rivals. And for someone to do it was basically, if you were an individual who was doing it, you were basically proclaiming to the world, because you had to do it openly, to the world that, you were cursing a person and their land, and you were willing to take the consequences on yourself. So it could be used in a very powerful way, negative way as well. And there were some protections against that kind of cursing. In fact, if you know how to use it, this very same rune can be used to protect yourself from that kind of cursing. But the way that, one of the ways in which it's used is to disperse things, very much like the porcupines created a whirlwind around the Wendigo to confuse it. So, but these are all kind of very esoteric forms of magic that I don't want to get too much into. But the point of this particular rune is that it holds within it the secrets both of stopping that sense of privation before it gets a hold of you, but it can also be used to curse someone else with it because you've been infected with it yourself. So it's one of those runes that has a great deal of dark and light in it. Now the rune that's to the far left, Urs, was a healing rune that was associated with the healing powers of Niflheimr, the healing powers that could come out of Gununga Gap, and was often used, and it actually literally represents like the first cow, the cosmic cow that gave birth to all the creatures on the earth. And she was connected esoterically to those ice streams or ice waves. She gave shape to them by licking them as they would form and gradually creating things. So this is a rune that could be used to actually protect yourself from poison. It was used to heal women who are having difficulty in childbirth, to heal certain kinds of fertility problems. So it was understood to be able to reach into that realm, that icy realm from which everything comes, and bring it up kind of in a generative way, in much the same way that trees emerge from the cold in winter, that kind of thing. So and it's the kind of force that would be used against something like a Wendigo spirit. You could use it to protect a household, or protect a mother, or protect a child. And this is a great little book if you can find it. It's called When the Chenoo Howls, Native American Tales of Terror by Joseph and James Bruchac, who are two wonderful indigenous storytellers. And this particular story, When the Chenoo Howls, is a very, very well-known story among the Micmac and other Algonquin peoples in the Northeast here. There are a number of versions of these stories. You can see here, this is a very different image of the Chenoo. The Chenoo is basically the same as a Wendigo. It's just the name that the being is called by the Micmac. So it's their name for it. They use that word instead of Wendigo, but it's basically essentially the same. And the same kind of personality, it feeds on people, it lures people out, it embodies kind of that icy heart. But this is a particular story, and it's one of my favorite stories. It's called The Maiden in the Chenoo. And basically, what this one of in the introduction to this story, basically they say that in many cases a Wendigo or a Chenoo is understood to have been a human being who has been tortured, becomes a tortured, violent, supernatural killer as a result of trauma, abuse, starvation, bad choices. In this story, a young woman and her two brothers have gone into a deep forest to hunt. They set up camp, and the two young men go off to track game, leaving their sister to tend the fires and prepare for the future processing of the meat that they hope to bring home. They have kind of a little hut a shelter that they've set up. She has also built a sweat lodge for them so that they can warm themselves and clean up upon their return. Now, unbeknownst to all of them, a Chenoo, a Wendigo, this vampiric cannibalistic giant, has been watching them set up camp, and as the brothers leave, he prepares to stalk, kill, and eat the young woman. The Chenoo goes up to the door of the temporary lodge and greets her from there as if you were a guest in order to trick his victim. She hears the call and thinks, now that can't be my brother's home so soon, and who could this possibly be so deep in the woods? So she cleverly looks through a chink in the lodge wall, and she sees the Chenoo standing there, waiting for her to come to the door so that he could gobble her up. And she thinks, my goodness, what am I going to do? So she paused for a moment and went to the door in order to stand next to it, but not in the opening itself, and answered back, "Oh, grandfather, where have you been for so long? I never thought I'd ever see you again. I can't come to the door right now because my hands are full, but please come in and make yourself warm by the fire while I bring you some food." Notice she doesn't look at him. He was confused by this response, so he swept open the door and stood in the doorway looking around for the young woman, because the sight of him was terrible. They are often depicted as being tall and misshapen. You sometimes can see large lolling eyes and a huge gaping mouth stained with blood. They may be covered with matted hair and wear body parts and bones of their victims strung around their necks as ornaments. They smell of rotted meat and gore. The young woman found ways of busying herself so that she wouldn't have to meet its gaze directly, because it was very difficult to look at. But she repeated her greeting. "Oh, grandfather, look at you. You must be so cold and hungry. Please come in and warm yourself, and I'll get you something to eat." The Chenoo was completely befuddled by her lack of fear, so much that he asked himself, "Is it possible that I have a grandchild?" So in that state, as she gestured, he allowed himself to be led to the central fire while she went off to get some food. And she knew that she was thinking about what food to get, and she was also thinking about how to protect herself. She knew that Chenus were understood to be in what we would call an undead position. They don't use that terminology in Algonquin, but that's kind of what they are. They're between life and death. Their hearts had become as ice, and they needed warm food, which is why they seek out live prey, to keep themselves in existence. Simply giving him food would not protect her, since their appetites were insatiable. Then she had an idea. And she came back with some warm gruel, and she said, "Grandfather, I've prepared a lovely sweat lodge for my brothers when they return. There's plenty of fuel, and it's large enough for you. Why don't you go take a sweat, rest and warm yourself, and I'll keep the fires going and will bring food to you whenever you call for it." He was so astonished by her generosity that he willingly allowed himself to be led to the sweat lodge, which was attached to the side of the camping lodge. She had already stoked the fire, the rocks were hot, so as he entered she simply passed the water bucket to him so he could steam up as he needed. Whenever he cried out for food, she brought him more. So for several hours she waited for her brothers to return, and she pushed in more fuel and brought food to the Chenoo. Now, meanwhile, her brothers had started back home, and when they drew near to the camp, they saw these huge footprints, Chenoo footprints, and they were headed towards the lodge. And of course, they were like, "Oh no, a Chenoo was hunting her sister." So they stashed most of their hard-earned game and started to run through the snow. They dared not speak out loud what they most feared they might find. They were surprised to see smoke still pouring from the lodge, but the footprints led right up to the door. So they gathered their weapons around and burst into the lodge. And they ran right into their sister, who was bringing more food to the Chenoo in the sweat lodge. The brothers were both overjoyed and confused. "Sister, we saw Chenoo prints coming up the door. What are you doing?" She quickly shushed them and gestured to the sweat lodge, using her hands and face to indicate where the Chenoo was and how she'd like them to play along. She loudly said, "Oh, grandfather, your grandsons have returned. Would you like to greet them?" The Chenoo cried out for more food, but in a weaker voice. He said, "Perhaps in a little while." So all night long, these three young people brought the Chenoo food and fuel. At some point, they could hear him weeping and calling out in anguish. At one point, they heard a kind of popping sound. They actually began to feel sorry for him, even though they were getting very tired. And then toward morning, the Chenoo fell silent. The young woman approached the sweat lodge door cautiously. "Grandfather, are you all right? Do you need anything?" And to her surprise, the door opened slightly, and an old withered arm reached out in entreaty, while a tired old man's voice quavered, "Granddaughter, could you bring me some water to drink? Everyone knows that Chenus don't drink water. They only drink blood." So she passed the water in, And the Chenu, now a shrunken old man, drank and drank. Finally he came to the door, opened it, and approached the young woman with something in his outstretched hand. It was what was left of his frozen Chenu heart, the heart of darkness that had gripped him when he'd been taken by the spell of despair and cursed and transformed into a monster. The young woman wrapped him in a blanket and took him to the central fire in the lodge, where they laid the frozen heart in the coals and watched it burn and melt away. Now the former Chenu was just a little old human man who needed protection, kindness, and forgiveness. In this story, the brothers and sister listened to his account of how he became a Chenu. They forgave him, adopted him as their grandfather, and took him back with them to their village, where he lived out the rest of his days. The young woman in this story demonstrates discernment at many different points along the way. She is knowledgeable of her surroundings. She is cautious, but always thinking about alternatives. She follows the rules of her culture, in this case hospitality, but is also able to think of how these rules might be used to advantage in this dangerous situation. Getting the demon into the sweat lodge was a great trick, because if he was simply a demon of some kind, he would have been sufficiently weakened upon her brother's return that they may have been able to dispatch him or rout him out. But the fact is that he's a Chenu, so she knows that at the core of him is a human heart. At every point, she's willing to see beyond mere appearance, not only for the sake of her own life, but for her brother's and ultimately for the Chenu himself. Finally, she understood that there may be a core of good in the Chenu, or a good reason why the Chenu came her way after all. So this is a very famous story about a Wendigo. So it's not in many of these stories, the Wendigo is dispatched. It is routed out. It is uprooted. It is dispersed. So the idea that there is just this monster out there, this icy-hearted monster that there is no answer for, really doesn't exist in indigenous storytelling here in North America. That's something that exists only in the fascinations of European fiction, more or less. So this is the last installment of ICE. I hope you've gotten something out of this. And remember that ICE is something that we need, and it may also be something that we face. But there's always a lesson to it. So allow yourself to be taught by ICE if it comes your way. Just don't allow it to take over your heart, because that's not where humans are really supposed to be.